She used to believe that if she just worked a little harder, pushed a little further, stayed up one more hour, the money would finally catch up to her exhaustion. Never did. And somewhere around her 43rd birthday, sitting alone at her desk with another bill open on the screen, she finally asked herself the question she'd been avoiding for 20 years. What if effort was never the answer? Not because she was lazy. She wasn't. She had built things, raised people, shown up for everyone every single day for decades. She had done everything she was told would work. The budgeting, the second job, the years of saying yes when her body screamed no. And still, the money slipped through her hands like sand she couldn't close her fingers around fast enough. What she didn't know, what almost no one tells women like her, is that there's a verse buried in scripture, one she'd heard read aloud in churches her whole life, that she had completely misunderstood. Not because she wasn't paying attention, but because no one ever explained what it actually meant. Seek ye first the kingdom. She thought it meant pray more, be good, wait patiently for some far-off reward in heaven. She had no idea it was actually a financial law, a precise, almost mathematical instruction about where wealth actually comes from, and where it absolutely does not. Florence Scovel Shinn understood this verse in a way that would change everything for the women who later discovered her work. Not as a comforting Bible quote, but as a key door. A sequence so simple it sounds almost too good to be true, and so often ignored that millions of hardworking women spend their whole lives chasing money the long way, never realizing there was a door standing open the entire time, just a few feet to their left. This is the story of the law she almost missed. And the moment everything in her life, her bank account, her body, her sense of who she even was, began quietly to shift. Let's call her Margaret. Not because that was her real name, but because somewhere, right now, a woman who looks nothing like her and lives nowhere near her, is living the exact same story under a different one. Margaret grew up watching her mother count coins on the kitchen counter at the end of every month. Not dramatically, not with tears, just quietly, methodically, the way you check a wound to see if it had stopped bleeding. Her mother never said the words, "We don't have enough." She didn't have to. The counting said it for her. And somewhere in that small kitchen, watching those coins get sorted into piles, a belief planted itself so deep in young Margaret that she never thought to question it for the next 30 years. Money is something you chase. And if you stop chasing, it disappears. So she became a chaser. Good one. The best kind. The kind nobody calls lazy, the kind everyone admires. She got the degree. Then the second certification just to be safe. She took the job that paid a little more but asked for a little more of her soul. She said yes to every extra shift, every late meeting, every "can you just handle this real quick," that somehow turned into 3 more hours of her evening. For years this looked like success from the outside. Title: modest house. Car that ran. People at church would say, "Margaret, you work so hard." And she'd smile, because what else could she do? Disagree. Admit that the hard work was actually a kind of fear wearing a respectable disguise. Here's what nobody tells women like Margaret. There are 2 ways to seek money. One way says, I will go out and get it. I will earn it, hunt it, prove myself worthy of it. And once I have enough of it, I will finally feel safe. The other way, the one Florence Scovel Shinn spent her whole life trying to explain to people who, like Margaret, had never heard it phrased this way, says something almost offensive to a hard-working woman's ears. Stop seeking the money directly. Seek something else first. And the money will have no choice but to follow. Margaret would have laughed if someone told her this in her 30s. Stop chasing money. She would have asked them what planet they lived on. She had bills. She had a daughter who needed braces. She had a mortgage that didn't care about her spiritual journey. But here's the strange thing about exhaustion, real bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes after 15-20 years of chasing. It eventually does something useful. It breaks the chaser down enough that she finally becomes willing to ask a question she would have dismissed before. What if I've had the order backwards this whole time? That question is where this verse begins. Not as religion, as mechanics, cause and effect. Florence Scovel Shinn, writing in the early 20th century to women not so different from Margaret, women who had been taught that struggle was the price of security, kept returning to a single phrase from the Sermon on the Mount. Most people who'd heard it in church 1,000 times had never once stopped to ask what it was actually instructing them to do. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. To Shinn, this wasn't poetry. It was a formula, a sequence with a strict, almost scientific order to it. Seek this first, and then, and only then, that gets added. Not earned through suffering, not extracted through effort. Added. The way a gift is added to something that was already complete on its own. Margaret had spent her whole life trying to manufacture all these things. The money, the security, the breathing room, through sheer force. Nobody had ever told her there was a first step she was skipping entirely. A step that, once taken, made the second step almost effortless by comparison. What was she missing? What was this kingdom that was supposed to come before everything else? That question alone is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's likely the same one quietly forming in your own mind right now. And the answer, once you understand it the way Margaret eventually did, has a way of rearranging everything you thought you knew about why money does or doesn't come to you. Here's where most people get stuck, and where Margaret got stuck too, for longer than she'd like to admit. When you hear the word kingdom, your mind probably goes somewhere far away. Clouds, pearly gates, something that happens after you die in some other place that has nothing to do with the very real, very present problem of rent being due on the first. Florence Scovel Shinn rejected that interpretation completely. To her, the kingdom Jesus spoke of wasn't a location. It was a state of consciousness, a way of seeing yourself and your life that exists entirely inside you. Available right now, in this moment, regardless of what your bank balance says. She called it the kingdom of right thinking. Some translations of the original Greek render it even more plainly. The kingdom of God is the realm where everything operates by perfect, harmonious law, and that realm exists within you, not somewhere beyond the clouds. So when the verse says, "Seek first the kingdom," Shinn understood it as an instruction to seek, first, a particular inner state. Not a place, posture, a way of standing inside your own mind. What does that posture actually look like? This is the part Margaret had to sit with for weeks before it clicked. It means seeking the consciousness of already having enough, before the bank statement agrees with you. It means seeking the felt sense of safety, of being provided for, of trusting that you live in an abundant universe rather than a scarce one, and seeking that feeling first, deliberately, as the primary act, rather than waiting for circumstances to hand it to you as a reward. This sounds, to the exhausted chaser, almost backwards. You want me to feel secure before I have the money that would make me secure? That's exactly the instruction. And it's not naive. It's not pretending. It's something far more precise than that. Think of it this way. A radio doesn't create the music. The music already exists, traveling invisibly through the air around you, all day, every day, in your kitchen, in your car, at your office desk. The radio's only job is to tune itself to the right frequency. Once it's tuned correctly, the music that was already there simply becomes audible. Most people, most exhausted, hard-working women like Margaret, spend their whole lives trying to build the music from scratch, draining, manufacturing, working themselves into the ground, trying to create a signal that was never theirs to create in the first place. They never realized that all they actually needed to do was tune. Seeking the kingdom first is the tuning. The money, all these things, is the music that was already playing, waiting for a receiver capable of picking it up. This is not the same as wishful thinking. Shinn was clear and almost stern about that distinction. The kingdom isn't a vague hope that things will work out. It's a specific, disciplined inner practice. Choosing thoughts of abundance over thoughts of lack, speaking and believing in supply rather than scarcity, refusing entry to the fear thoughts that had run Margaret's entire financial life since that night in her mother's kitchen. And here's where it gets uncomfortable in the most useful way possible. This means the chasing itself, the overworking, the overfunctioning, the saying yes to everything out of fear of saying no, was never actually the cause of any financial breakthrough Margaret ever experienced. It was, at best, irrelevant to it. At worst, it was actively working against her. Because every hour spent striving from a place of I don't have enough was an hour spent reinforcing the very frequency she was trying to escape. She wasn't lazy. She had simply been tuning to the wrong station her entire life, and turning the volume up louder and louder, hoping that effort alone would somehow change the frequency. Never can. Not because effort is bad, but because effort applied to the wrong cause produces, at best, exhaustion. At worst, it produces exactly the lack it was trying so desperately to outrun. So if the money was never going to come from the striving, where exactly was Margaret supposed to begin? Before Margaret could even begin to seek this kingdom, she had to do something far less comfortable first. She had to go back into that kitchen, the one with her mother and the coins, and look honestly at what she'd actually learned there. Because it wasn't just money is something you chase. That was only the surface belief. Underneath it, buried deeper, was something far more dangerous. Something that had quietly steered every financial decision of her adult life without her ever once naming it out loud. Rest is for people who've earned it. And you haven't earned it yet. Where does a belief like that come from? Not from a single sentence anyone ever said to her directly. Comes from watching. From decades of small moments stacked on top of each other. Her mother apologizing for sitting down before the dishes were finished. Her grandmother saying, "I'll rest when I'm gone," like it was a badge of honor instead of a quiet tragedy. The particular tightness in a woman's shoulders when she allows herself to receive instead of give. Margaret absorbed all of it before she ever had the language to question it. By the time she was an adult, the belief had fused itself so completely with her sense of being a good person that she couldn't tell the difference between the two anymore. Working hard and being worthy of love had become, in her nervous system, the exact same sensation. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she talked about race consciousness, the inherited beliefs passed down through generations of women, absorbed not through teaching but through watching, through osmosis, through the simple act of growing up in a household where struggle was treated as proof of virtue. And here is the part that stopped Margaret cold the first time she really let it land. If struggle is what you believe proves your worthiness, then some hidden part of you will always, quietly manufacture more struggle to prove it again. Not because you want suffering, but because a part of your subconscious mind genuinely believes that ease is dangerous, that if things ever became easy, you would somehow lose your right to be loved, to be respected, to belong. This is why so many hard-working women, brilliant women, capable women, women who could run a small country if you gave them the chance, find themselves financially exhausted despite doing everything right. It was never a lack of competence. It was a subconscious loyalty to an old story that equated ease with danger and struggle with safety. Shinn had a particular way of describing how these inherited beliefs operate. She said the subconscious mind is like fertile soil. It doesn't judge the seeds you plant in it. It simply grows whatever is planted, faithfully, without question. If a woman plants, "I must suffer to deserve," for 30-40 years, the soil doesn't argue. It simply produces a life that requires suffering before anything good is allowed to arrive. Margaret had been an extraordinary gardener her entire life, just planting the wrong seed with relentless devotion, decade after decade. Here's the uncomfortable mirror this offers you, if you're willing to look into it for a moment. What did the women who raised you believe about rest? About receiving? About what it meant to want more without first collapsing from exhaustion to earn it? You don't have to answer out loud, but sit with it. Because whatever the honest answer is, it has likely been quietly running your financial life this entire time, completely unexamined. The way water runs through old pipes you never think to check until something finally breaks. The good news, and Shinn was emphatic about this, is that soil can be replanted. The subconscious doesn't care how long a belief has been there. It only cares what you plant today and tomorrow and the day after, with enough repetition and enough sincerity that the old growth eventually gets crowded out by the new. But replanting requires something Margaret had never once given herself permission to do. It requires rest, not as a reward she had to earn, but as the very first seed. There's a second word in that verse that almost everyone skips past without a second thought. Most people hear "seek first the kingdom" and stop paying attention right there, missing the phrase that comes immediately after it, a phrase Florence Scovel Shinn considered just as important as the kingdom itself. And his righteousness. For Margaret, that word, righteousness, carried decades of baggage. It sounded like church basements and Sunday school guilt. It sounded like one more thing she was supposed to be and wasn't. But Shinn defined it in a way that had almost nothing to do with how Margaret had always understood it. Jesus. That's how Shinn liked to break the word apart. Not righteous, as in holy or pious, but quite literally, the right use of one's mind, one's energy, one's resources. Using your inner faculties correctly, the way they were designed to be used, rather than the way fear had trained you to use them. And this is where the verse becomes almost shockingly practical for a woman like Margaret, who had spent her entire life believing that wanting more money, wanting ease, wanting a financial cushion, wanting to stop counting coins on a kitchen counter the way her mother once did, was somehow a character flaw. Something she should feel quietly ashamed of wanting. The right use of the mind, according to Shinn, includes the right use of desire itself. Wanting abundance isn't greed. Wanting rest isn't laziness. Wanting to never again feel the particular terror of an unexpected bill is not a spiritual failing. It is, in fact, part of seeking the kingdom correctly, because a mind weighted down by guilt about its own desires cannot hold the clear, peaceful frequency that allows supply to flow toward it. This was the piece that finally cracked something open in Margaret. She had always assumed that wanting more money made her less spiritual, less good, somehow further from God rather than closer. So she had spent years performing a strange kind of penance, denying herself rest, denying herself ease, denying herself the very things she secretly longed for, as if suffering were the entrance fee for being allowed to receive. Shinn would have called this a complete misuse of righteousness. Guilt is not humility. Self-denial is not virtue. A woman who exhausts herself out of some unspoken belief that she doesn't deserve ease is not seeking the kingdom. She is, without realizing it, worshipping lack, treating scarcity itself like a kind of god she owes her loyalty to. So here's the second half of the instruction, the part almost nobody talks about. Seeking the kingdom means seeking a consciousness of abundance. Seeking his righteousness means releasing the guilt that has kept you from allowing that abundance in. Both pieces, together, form the complete first step, the step that has to happen before all these things can be added. Margaret began, slowly, almost embarrassingly, to practice something that felt at first like rebellion. She let herself sit down before the dishes were done. She said no to an extra shift and didn't immediately spiral into explaining herself to anyone, not even in her own head. She caught herself mid-apology for resting and simply stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Let the silence sit there instead, uncomfortable but unbroken. Felt at first like she was doing something wrong. That old fused belief, working hard equals being worthy of love, fought back hard in those early weeks. Her body actually ached with the strangeness of stillness, the way a muscle aches after being stretched in a direction it's never moved before. But here's something worth pausing on, something that matters more than almost anything else in this entire video. If you've ever felt a flicker of guilt simply for wanting things to be easier, for wanting to stop proving yourself through exhaustion, that guilt was never proof of your unworthiness. It was proof of an old, inherited belief that was never actually yours to carry in the first place. And the fact that you're still here, still listening, still willing to ask, what if I've had this backwards? That itself is the beginning of right useness. That's the kingdom, quietly, already starting to take root. This channel exists for exactly this moment, The moment a woman realizes she's allowed to put the old story down. If something in what you just heard landed somewhere real, subscribing helps this message reach the next woman sitting alone with her own bills open on her own screen, and it means you'll be here the next time we go further into this work together. Margaret didn't change everything overnight, but something had shifted in the soil. And soil that's been tended differently, even for a few weeks, begins to behave differently than soil left untouched for 30 years. What grew next surprised even her. Here's where the verse delivers its quiet, almost devastating logic, the part Margaret had read 100 times without ever truly hearing it. And all these things shall be added unto you. Added, not earned, not extracted, not fought for. Added, the way a final number gets added to a sum that was already mostly complete. The way something extra gets placed gently on top of a foundation that had already been laid. Florence Scovel Shinn pointed out something most readers miss entirely. The verse doesn't say, and you shall go get these things. It doesn't say, and these things shall reward your relentless effort. It says they shall be added unto you. Language that implies movement toward the person, not movement by the person. This is the part that used to genuinely unsettle Margaret, because it ran against everything she'd built her identity on. If money was something added to her, rather than something she had to chase down and capture, what did that make all those years of striving? Were they wasted? Pointless? Not wasted, Shinn would have gently corrected. Misdirected. There's a difference. The effort itself wasn't the problem. Margaret's intelligence, her discipline, her capacity for hard work were real assets, not flaws to be ashamed of. The problem was where she'd been pointing all of that capacity. She had aimed her formidable will directly at the money itself, like trying to grab smoke with her bare hands, when the entire time, the will was meant to be aimed somewhere else, at the inner state from which the money would naturally, almost inevitably, flow. Picture a fruit tree for a moment. Not the rivers or fists you might expect from this kind of teaching, something simpler, and more honest about how growth actually works. A farmer doesn't stand at the base of an apple tree, yanking on the branches, screaming at the fruit to ripen faster. That farmer would exhaust himself completely and produce nothing but bruised, unripe apples torn down before their time. Instead, the farmer tends the roots. He waters. He makes sure the soil holds the right nutrients. He protects the tree from disease and drought. He does this faithfully, season after season, often without seeing a single apple appear for months at a time. And then, quietly, almost without ceremony, the fruit arrives. Not because he forced it, but because he correctly tended the one thing that was actually within his control. The root system, invisible beneath the surface, doing its work in the dark. Margaret had spent 30 years yanking on branches, exhausting herself trying to force fruit that wasn't ready, while almost entirely ignoring the root system beneath her. The actual soil of her beliefs, her sense of worthiness, her relationship to rest and receiving that we talked about earlier. When she finally redirected her energy toward the roots, toward tending her thoughts, her self-talk, her quiet refusal to keep punishing herself for wanting ease, something began to shift that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with consequence. A former colleague reached out about a freelance project Margaret hadn't even applied for. A bill she'd been dreading turned out to be smaller than expected due to a billing correction she never requested. Small things at first. The kind of things a chasing mind would have dismissed as coincidence. But Shinn never believed in coincidence. She believed in law. Cause and effect. Operating with the same precision in the financial realm as gravity operates in the physical one. Tend the kingdom and the things get added. Every time. Not because the universe is sentimental, but because it is exact. This doesn't mean Margaret stopped working entirely. And it doesn't mean you should either. The instruction was never do nothing. It was seek first. Meaning the inner work comes before the outer striving, sets the direction for it, transforms striving from desperate grasping into calm, confident, well-aimed action. Effort born from peace produces entirely different fruit than effort born from fear. Even when, from the outside, The two might look identical. The difference is in the root. It always was. By now you might be wondering what this actually looks like, day to day. Because a beautiful concept means very little to a woman who still has to walk past her mailbox, still has to open her banking app, still has to face the very real numbers that don't care how spiritually enlightened she's becoming. This is fair. And it's exactly the question Margaret asked herself once the initial relief of, "Oh, I've had this backwards," wore off and the practical reality set back in. Florence Scovel Shinn was, above all things, a deeply practical woman. She had spent years as a successful illustrator before turning to this work, and that same precision, the eye of someone who understood that beautiful results come from disciplined, repeated technique, shows up everywhere in how she taught people to actually seek the kingdom. Not through vague hoping, through specific, repeated, almost stubborn redirection of the mind, every single time it wandered back into fear. For Margaret, this meant catching herself mid-spiral. The old pattern was so well worn that her mind could slide into panic about money almost without her noticing. A bill arrives, and before she's even finished reading it, her chest tightens, her thoughts start racing toward worst-case scenarios. Her whole nervous system braces for impact the way it always had. The new practice wasn't pretending the bill didn't exist. It was noticing the spiral starting and consciously, deliberately, interrupting it with a different thought, one rooted in the kingdom rather than in lack. Something as simple as, internally, I am divinely provided for, and this is being handled. Not shouted, not performed, just stated quietly, the way you'd state any other fact you fully believed. At first, this felt like lying to herself. How could she claim to be provided for when the checking account told a different story? But Shinn had an answer for this exact resistance, one that reframed the whole practice for Margaret in a way that finally made sense. You are not describing your current bank balance. You are describing the truth of the kingdom, the deeper reality that exists beneath circumstances, the way the sun continues existing behind a cloud even on the grayest day. The cloud is real. Nobody's denying the cloud. But the cloud is not the sun, and circumstances are not the kingdom. Claiming the kingdom's truth while clouds are still visible isn't denial. It's allegiance. A choice about which reality you're going to keep your attention rooted in, even when the temporary one is loudly insisting on your full belief. Margaret began practicing this multiple times a day, especially in the moments her old fear pattern used to take over completely. Checking the mail, opening bills, lying awake at 3 in the morning doing the math her exhausted brain insisted on doing whether she wanted it to or not. Each time the same redirect, not forcing positivity, simply refusing to let the old, inherited story have the final word anymore. And slowly, not overnight, not in some dramatic single moment, but slowly, the way roots actually grow, her relationship to money started to feel different from the inside before it ever looked different on paper. The tightness in her chest when she opened her banking app began to ease. The 3 a.m. spiraling happened less often, and when it did happen, it resolved faster, because she now had somewhere else to direct her mind besides the spiral itself. If you've made it this far into this video, you've likely already started doing some version of this redirect, even just by listening, even just by considering that the old story might not be the only available one. That alone is worth acknowledging and worth coming back to, because this channel will keep walking through these laws, one at a time with you. If you haven't yet, subscribing means you won't miss the next piece of this work. And it helps this particular message find the next woman who needs to hear that she's allowed to put the old story down too. 3 months in, Margaret noticed something she almost didn't trust at first. The fear hadn't disappeared completely. Old patterns rarely vanish entirely, and Shinn never promised they would. But underneath the fear, for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was something steadier. A floor beneath her feet that hadn't been there before. Not because her bank account had transformed overnight into something unrecognizable, but because she was no longer standing on circumstances anymore. She was standing on the kingdom, and circumstances, she was discovering, have a way of eventually rearranging themselves to match whatever ground a person is actually standing on. Let's talk about what actually happened in Margaret's outer life, because the inner shifts matter. But they were never the point. The point was always what they made room for. About 5 months into this new practice, Margaret's company announced restructuring. The kind of announcement that, in her old life, would have sent her into weeks of sleepless panic, already mentally drafting resignation letters, already calculating how many months her savings could stretch. Instead, something unexpected happened. She felt the old fear rise. Of course she did. She was still human, still living in a body that remembered 30 years of scarcity. But underneath it, that floor was still there. She caught the spiral early. She redirected. I am divinely provided for, and this is being handled, regardless of how this restructuring unfolds. 3 weeks later, in a meeting she'd expected to be about layoffs, Margaret's manager instead offered her a newly created position, one that hadn't existed before, designed specifically around the skills Margaret had spent years quietly developing without anyone seeming to notice. The pay increase wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And more than the number itself, what struck Margaret was the manner in which it arrived. Unsought, enforced, added rather than fought for. She told a friend about it weeks later, almost embarrassed by how undramatic the story sounded out loud. There was no grand decree, no single moment of breakthrough, just months of quietly tending different soil. And then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, fruit that had apparently been growing the entire time, invisible beneath the surface, finally became visible. This is something worth sitting with, because it runs against everything the chasing mind expects. The chasing mind wants drama. It wants a single decisive action, a single brave conversation, a single moment where effort visibly produces reward, because that's the only language it's ever been taught to trust. But the kingdom rarely announces itself with fanfare. It tends to arrive the way morning arrives, not as an event you witness, but as a gradual brightening you only notice once you look up and realize the dark has, somewhere along the way, already lifted. Florence Scovel Shinn wrote extensively about this pattern, this tendency for the right thing to arrive through right channels. Meaning channels you couldn't have engineered or predicted, because they require pieces moving that are entirely outside your control. Margaret didn't create that new position. She didn't lobby for it, didn't network her way into it, didn't perform extra hours to earn it. She simply stopped blocking her own good with fear long enough for something already in motion to find its way to her. This is perhaps the hardest part of this entire teaching for a lifelong chaser to accept. That some of what you've been straining for your whole life was never going to come through straining at all. That the years of overworking weren't a wasted investment exactly. They built real skill, real character, real capability, but they were never, themselves, the mechanism through which your breakthrough would arrive. The mechanism was always the kingdom. The straining was simply what filled the waiting room until you finally walked through the right door. Margaret still works. She still has ambition, still shows up, still cares about doing good work. But something fundamental shifted in why she does it now. She's no longer working from the belief that exhaustion proves her worth, or that ease must be earned through suffering first. She works now the way the farmer tends the orchard, attentive, consistent, but no longer yanking on branches, no longer demanding fruit arrive on her panicked timeline rather than its own. And here's what surprised her most months later looking back. The relief she'd been chasing her entire life, that elusive feeling of enough, of safety, of finally being able to exhale, never actually arrived through the money. It arrived first in the kingdom, in that quiet redirection of thought she practiced in her car, at her kitchen table, in the dark at 3 a.m. The money simply confirmed what had already become true inside her. It was always going to be added. It was just waiting for her to stop blocking the door. Maybe you're not Margaret. Maybe your story has different details. A different job, a different kitchen, a different inherited belief that's been quietly running your relationship with money since before you had words for it. But if any part of what you've heard so far made something in your chest tighten with recognition, this next part is for you specifically. Because understanding a law intellectually and actually living inside it are two very different things. Margaret didn't transform her life by hearing this teaching once. She transformed it by returning to it daily, especially on the days her old patterns screamed the loudest. So let's make this practical. Let's talk about what seeking the kingdom first actually looks like in the texture of an ordinary day. Your day, specifically, not just a story about a woman named Margaret, starts the moment you wake up. Before your feet hit the floor, before your mind has a chance to start its usual inventory of worries, there's a brief window. Shinn called it sacred, though you don't need to use that word if it doesn't fit you, where you get to choose what you plant first. Most people, without realizing it, reach immediately for their phone, for the day's first dose of comparison, obligation, and noise. The chasing mind loves this moment, because it lets fear get a head start before peace ever has a chance to speak. What if, instead, before anything else, you offered your mind a single sentence rooted in the kingdom rather than in lack? Not a long ritual, not anything elaborate, something as simple as, I am divinely provided for. My good is already on its way to me through right channels in right ways. Said quietly, said as fact, not as wish. This single redirection, repeated daily, does something Shinn described almost like compound interest for the soul. Each repetition doesn't just affect that one moment, it slowly retrains the soil itself, making the next redirect easier than the one before it, until eventually, abundance thinking stops requiring effort altogether and simply becomes the new default. Then there are the harder moments, the ones Margaret faced at the mailbox, at the banking app, in the dark at 3 a.m. These moments will still come for you. The kingdom doesn't promise an absence of bills, an absence of hard months, an absence of moments where fear knocks loudly on the door. What it promises is a different response available to you the instant fear knocks. A floor to stand on that wasn't there before. When that moment comes for you, and it will possibly even today, try this. Notice the tightening in your chest without judging yourself for it. That tightening isn't weakness. It's 30, 40, 50 years of inherited pattern doing exactly what it was trained to do. Then, gently, without force, offer the redirect. This is not the kingdom's truth. This is a cloud. The sun is still there. And let that be enough. Even if your circumstances haven't caught up to that truth yet, they will. Shinn's law doesn't depend on your circumstances agreeing with you first. It depends on you holding the kingdom's truth despite them, until law does what law always does, eventually, faithfully, without exception. There's one more piece worth naming because it's the piece most people skip, the same piece Margaret almost skipped. Release the guilt around wanting this to be easier. You are allowed to want ease. You are allowed to want a financial life that doesn't require you to prove your worth through exhaustion first. That desire isn't a character flaw to manage. It's information, pointing you accurately toward the very kingdom you're being asked to seek. You don't have to fix your entire financial life today. You don't have to undo 30 years of inherited belief in a single afternoon. You only have to plant the next seed correctly, and then the one after that. The kingdom was never asking for perfection. It was only ever asking for direction. If you've stayed with me this far into this video, I want to pause for just a moment and speak directly to you. It's not an accident that you're still here, 40 minutes into a video about a verse you've probably heard read aloud 100 times in your life without ever once stopping to ask what it actually meant. Something in you is ready to hear this differently. Something in you is tired, not lazy, just genuinely tired, of chasing money the long way and coming up short year after year no matter how hard you push. I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and stay with us here every day. This isn't about growing a number for its own sake. It's because every single subscriber means this particular message. The message that you're allowed to stop proving your worth through exhaustion, that there's a kingdom inside you that's been waiting patiently this whole time, reaches one more woman who needed to hear it as badly as you did. It also means you'll be notified the moment a new video goes live, so you don't miss the next law. The next piece of this work we're building together, one teaching at a time. If something in this video has already started shifting something in you, even something small, even just a loosening in your chest as you've been listening, I'd genuinely love to know. Leave a comment and tell me which part landed the hardest. Sometimes it's the kitchen counter. Sometimes it's the guilt around wanting ease. Sometimes it's simply hearing someone finally say out loud what you've quietly suspected about your own life for years. Whatever it was for you, naming it in the comments does something. It lets the next woman scrolling through, hesitating, wondering if this channel is for her, see herself reflected in your words before she even presses play. Now let's come back to where we left off, because there's one more layer to this teaching, maybe the most important one. And it has to do with what happens after the breakthrough. Because Margaret's story doesn't end with the new position at work. If anything, that was only the beginning of a different kind of test. A few months after the promotion, an old fear resurfaced. Different clothing, same underlying voice. With more money finally flowing in, a new whisper started. Don't get comfortable. This won't last. Something will happen to take it away, the way it always has before. This is the part Florence Scovel Shinn warned about more than almost anything else in her writing. The danger of seeking the kingdom just long enough to receive a breakthrough, and then quietly abandoning the practice the moment things start looking better, sliding right back into old fear, thinking the second the immediate crisis lifts. The kingdom isn't a one-time transaction. It's not a vending machine you visit once during a crisis and then walk away from once you've gotten what you needed. It's a continuous residence. A place you keep choosing to live, not just visit during emergencies. Margaret had to learn this the hard way, the same way most people do. The new fear about losing what she'd gained was, ironically, the exact same fear frequency that had created the original lack in the first place, simply wearing a more sophisticated disguise now that there was something tangible at stake to lose. If she let that fear take root unchallenged, she risked recreating, slowly, the very scarcity she'd worked so hard to release herself from. So the practice continued. Not because she hadn't made it yet, but because the kingdom was never a finish line to cross and be done with. It was, and remains, an ongoing way of living, a daily choice between two frequencies, made over and over for the rest of a life. Some days that choice comes easily. Other days, it takes real, deliberate effort to keep choosing peace over panic. But here's what Margaret discovered 2 years into this practice that I think is worth carrying with you as we move toward the end of this video. The choosing itself gets easier. Not because life stops presenting challenges. It doesn't, it never will for any of us. But because the floor beneath her feet by then had become so familiar, so well worn by repetition, that returning to it no longer felt like rebellion against 3 decades of inherited fear. Simply felt like home. There's a particular evening Margaret still thinks about, even now. Nothing dramatic happened. That's exactly why it stayed with her. She was sitting at her kitchen table. A different table now, in a different home, though she couldn't tell you when exactly the move had happened, only that it had, gradually, the way most real change does. The bills were paid. Not extravagantly. Not without thought or care. But paid. Without the old electric panic that used to live in her chest every time an envelope arrived. She wasn't thinking about money in that moment, which was, in itself, the entire point. For the first time in longer than she could remember, money simply wasn't the loudest voice in the room. It had become quiet, huddled. The way a house guest eventually stops feeling like a guest and simply becomes part of the household, present without announcing itself. She thought instead about her mother. About those coins on that other kitchen counter decades ago, sorted into careful piles by a woman who never once said, "We don't have enough," out loud, because she didn't have to. Margaret didn't feel anger toward her mother in that memory anymore. Just a kind of tenderness for a woman who had simply never been handed the key Margaret now carried. Her mother had sought the things directly, her whole life, the only way she knew how. Nobody had ever told her there was another order, another sequence, a kingdom that came first. Margaret didn't fix this for her mother. That story had already finished in its own way long ago. But something in Margaret softened, sitting there, understanding finally that the chasing hadn't been her mother's failure, any more than it had been her own. It had simply been the inheritance, passed down unexamined, the way inheritances usually are, until someone somewhere along the line finally stops, looks at what's been handed to her, and decides to plant something different. You are allowed to be that someone. Not because you've done anything to earn it. Not because you've suffered enough, finally, to deserve a different outcome. Simply because you're here, having listened this far, already willing to ask the question that changes everything. What if I've had the order backwards this whole time? The kingdom isn't waiting for you to become someone else first. It isn't waiting for you to fix everything, prove everything, exhaust yourself into worthiness. It's available to you exactly as you are, in this exact moment, sitting wherever you're sitting right now, however your bank account currently reads. Seek it first. Let the rest be added. If this video found you at the right moment, and I have a feeling it found at least one of you exactly when you needed it, share it with 5 women in your life who are still chasing the long way, still yanking on branches, still believing exhaustion is the entrance fee for ease. You might be the one who finally hands them the key nobody handed you for 30 years. And before you go, I'd love to know, what law, what teaching, what piece of this work should we sit with together next? Leave it in the comments. Tell me honestly where you are right now. This channel exists because of conversations exactly like that one. Until then, may your kingdom take root quietly, the way all real things do. And may everything else, in its own perfect time, simply be added.